They say that before the great white silence falls, the earth itself holds its breath. But for Iron Shell, a man whose bones had felt 70 winters come and go, the silence was never empty. It was a warning. He stood at the edge of the timberline, his hand gnarled like the root of an ancient oak, tightening around the staff of his lodgepole. His fingers were numb, the joints aching with a familiar, biting fire. This was not the playful snow of early autumn. This was the Wazir, the north wind, coming to claim what was left of the living. Iron Shell watched the buffalo. The younger braves, full of fire and misplaced certainty, wanted to huddle in the lowlands away from the biting air. But Iron Shell knew better. To hide from the wind is to let it hunt you. To survive, you must understand its heart. Suddenly, the sky collapsed. In a heartbeat, the world turned white. Not a soft, powdery white, but a blinding, suffocating sheet of ice that stripped away the horizon. You couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. Every breath felt like swallowing broken glass. The cold didn't just touch his skin. It reached inside his chest, trying to still the steady beat of a heart that had outlived sons, daughters, and 3 great chiefs. Before we continue our journey into the wild, subscribe to Wildbound History and tell us in the comments what country and city are you watching from. This is the moment where the spirit wavers, when the weight of 70 years feels too heavy to carry another inch. Iron Shell felt the siren song of the snow, the strange, lethal warmth that comes just before the blood freezes. It would be so easy to simply close his eyes, to let the drift become his blanket. He thought of his wife, Martha, named in the mission schools but always his Winona in the dark of the night, and how her hands used to feel against his neck. But he couldn't stop. Not yet. Behind him, 3 miles into the blinding white, was his grandson, Silas. Silas was strong, but he lacked the old blood memory. He didn't know how to read the lean of the grass under the ice. If Iron Shell fell here, the lineage of 1,000 years of survival would die in a snowbank. "Not today," he whispered, though his voice was nothing but a rasp. "I am the son of the Great Plains. You cannot take me until I have taught the boy how to live." He began to move, not toward the open plains where the European explorers would later perish by the hundreds, but toward the Badlands coulees, the deep, jagged gashes in the earth that the white men called a curse, but the Lakota called a sanctuary. The wind roared, a physical weight pushing against his chest, trying to drive the air from his lungs. Every step was a battle of will against biology. His legs shook. The muscles in his thighs felt like they were tearing. He was an old man fighting a god, and for a moment it looked as though the god would win. He reached the edge of the ravine. His lungs were burning, his vision fading at the edges. He wasn't just fighting the storm, he was fighting time itself. He slid down the embankment, the jagged rocks tearing at his buffalo skin robes until he hit the bottom. There, in the belly of the earth, the wind died to a low growl. But the cold was still there, waiting. He had reached the shelter, but he was alone, exhausted, and the temperature was dropping to a point where even the trees would begin to shatter. He reached into his pouch. His hands trembled so violently he nearly dropped his fire striker. This was the first test. If he couldn't make a spark, the morning sun would find only a statue of ice. It is a terrifying thing for a man who has provided for a tribe his entire life to realize his hands may finally fail him. Iron Shell stared at his fingers. They looked like strangers to him, gray, stiff, and unresponsive. In the silence of the ravine, away from the wind's roar, he could hear the sound of his own mortality, the thudding of a heart that was running out of fuel. He thought of the stories the elders told when he was but a boy. They spoke of the Pite Oyate, the buffalo people, and how they survived the great frost. By huddling so close, their heartbeats became one. But Iron Shell was alone. His grandson Silas was still out there, hopefully following the markers Iron Shell had left before the whiteout became total. "Grandfather," he whispered, invoking the spirit of the earth, "give my hands the heat of the summer sun." Just for a moment, The flame was no bigger than a dragonfly, but to Iron Shell it was the sun itself. He fed it tiny slivers of bark, his movements slow and deliberate. He couldn't afford a mistake. A single sneeze, a single slip of the hand, and the darkness would reclaim the space. As the heat began to radiate, he didn't pull back. He pressed his frozen palms directly toward the flame, letting the skin blister if it had to. The pain was a gift. Pain meant the nerves were still alive. Pain meant he was still a man and not yet a ghost. But survival in the Great Plains blizzard wasn't just about fire. Fire was a temporary lie. The Lakota secret was deeper. It was about the geometry of the land and the memory of the animals. To the untrained eye, the snow is the enemy. To the Lakota, the snow is a blanket. Iron Shell knew that beneath the drifts, the temperature remained constant, shielded from the wind chill that could drop to 50 degrees below zero in a matter of minutes. He dug with a rhythmic, desperate strength, pulling the heavy, wet powder aside until he had carved a hollow just large enough for a man and a boy. He lined the floor with the cedar boughs he had carried in his pack, the immortal tree that kept the dampness of the earth from leaching the last of his body heat. A shadow appeared at the mouth of the ravine, tall, staggered, and nearly bent double. It was Silas. The boy collapsed into the hollow, his eyelashes frozen shut, his skin the color of blue clay. He wasn't breathing right. His lungs were seizing from the crystal air. Iron Shell didn't offer words of comfort. There was no time for the softness of grandfathers. He grabbed the boy by the shoulders and shook him hard. "Do not sleep," Iron Shell barked, his voice cracking like a whip. "If you sleep now, you sleep forever. Look at the fire. Feed it your spirit, Silas. We are Lakota. The winter does not own us. It only tests if we are still worthy of the spring." This was the oldest medicine, the sharing of the soul through the skin. Iron Shell felt the boy's violent tremors against his chest. He felt his own heat being drained away, pulled into the shivering void of the youth's body. It was a sacrifice of years. Every degree of warmth he gave Silas was a minute less of life he might have for himself. But as he sat there in the dark, the fire flickering low, Iron Shell didn't feel fear. He felt a strange, quiet peace. He smelled the scent of the buffalo robe, the musk of the earth, the smoke of 1,000 campfires, and the faint, lingering aroma of the dried herbs his wife used to stitch into the linings. Outside, the world was ending. Trees were snapping like toothpicks under the weight of the ice. The wolves were silent, huddling in their dens. Any man who stayed on the surface was already a memory. But here, in the belly of the ravine, 2 generations held onto each other. Iron Shell closed his eyes, listening to the boy's heartbeat slowly sink with his own. He was exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that goes beyond the muscles and settles into the very marrow of the bone. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, the white walls of the snow cave vanished. In the heart of the storm, the mind seeks refuge in the sun. Iron Shell drifted. He wasn't in the cave anymore. He was back in the moon of ripening cherries. He could feel the sun on his shoulders, a weight of pure, golden honey. He could smell the wild sage and the sweetgrass, scents so vivid they made his phantom mouth water. Beside him stood Ilara. She was holding a bundle of drying meat, her eyes crinkling with a joke she hadn't yet told. This was before the great sickness. This was before the iron horse began to scream across the horizon. This was when the world was wide, and the buffalo covered the earth like a living brown carpet. This is the cruelty of memory. It shows us not just what we had, but the ease with which we took it for granted. He remembered the feel of Ilara's hand, not the gnarled, frozen thing he possessed now, but a hand that was warm, supple, and full of life. "We will have many sons," she had whispered that day, and they did. They had sons who ran like the wind and daughters whose laughter was like the bubbling of a mountain creek. But the years are a thief. The winters come one by one and they take. They take the strength from the legs, they take the vision from the eyes, and eventually they take the people who make the world feel like home. He had buried her in a winter just like this one. Not because she was weak, but because the cold is an opportunist. It finds the small crack in the armor, a cough that won't go away, a heart that tires of the struggle. He remembered the silence of the lodge after she was gone, the way the fire seemed to put out no heat at all. He had wanted to follow her then. He had sat in the snow, waiting for the wazir to take him, but he had heard a cry, a small, sharp cry from the corner of the lodge. It was Silas, a babe then, left behind by a daughter who had also succumbed to the frost. The warmth of the memory was gone, replaced by a cold so profound it felt like lead in his veins. He looked down at Silas. The boy's color was returning. His breathing was deeper, more rhythmic. The sacrifice was working. The old wood was burning itself out to keep the young sapling alive. But the fire was dying. Iron Shell reached for the last of his fuel, but his hand struck only cold stone. He had used it all. The storm showed no signs of breaking. The wind above the ravine sounded like a freight train, a relentless, crushing force. He looked at his grandson, then at the dying embers. He knew what the silence meant now. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the presence of the end. "Ilara," he whispered into the dark. "Is it time?" The only answer was the hiss of the last coal turning to grey ash. When the light goes, the world shrinks. It pulls inward until your entire universe is only as large as the skin you inhabit. For Iron Shell, the darkness was not empty. It was crowded with the ghosts of the life he had lived. He sat in the hollowed-out belly of the snow, the weight of the drifts above him, feeling like the weight of the years. He could no longer feel his feet. The sensation had moved upward, a creeping, numbing ice that had claimed his ankles and was now gnawing at his knees. He knew this feeling. It was the white sleep. It starts as a sting, turns into an ache, and finally it becomes a beautiful, seductive lie of comfort. He thought of the European travelers he had seen in his youth, the long knives and the fur trappers. They would arrive with their iron stoves and their heavy wool, confident that they could conquer the plains. But the plains are not a kingdom to be conquered. They are a spirit to be respected. He remembered finding a group of them once, years ago, near the banks of the Powder River. They had died in a circle, huddled around a wagon that they had broken apart for firewood. They had burned everything. Their furniture, their journals, their memories, and still the cold had found them. They died with their eyes wide open, staring at a sky they didn't understand. They died because they fought the storm. They tried to outrun it or outburn it. They didn't know how to become part of it. "Shh, little eagle," Iron Shell whispered. "The earth is just holding us for a while, like a seed in the winter ground. We are not dying. We are waiting for the sun to remember our names." But in his heart, Iron Shell felt the shadow lengthening. The isolation was the hardest part. To be so close to the world of the living, to know that somewhere, miles away, there was a village with steaming pots of stew and the sound of dogs barking, and yet to be as far away as the stars. He was alone in the deep silence of the great mystery. He felt the thin thread of his life stretching, fraying, becoming translucent. He began to pray, not with words, but with a low, vibrating hum in his chest. A song for the ancestors, a song for the buffalo, a song for the cold itself. There is a silence that screams. By the second day of the storm, the hunger had set in, not just the hunger of the stomach, but the hunger of the blood. The body begins to consume itself to keep the core alive. It burns the fat, then the muscle, then the very will to survive. Iron Shell watched the entrance of their snow burrow. The opening had nearly drifted shut, leaving only a tiny blowhole for air. The oxygen was thin. Every breath was an effort of the diaphragm. He felt a profound sense of claustrophobia. The earth was pressing in on him, the white walls closing like a fist. "Grandfather," Silas's voice was a ghost of a sound. "Are we dead?" Iron Shell forced a smile, though his frozen skin cracked with the effort. "Do you feel the hunger in your belly, Silas?" The boy nodded weakly. "Then you are not dead," Iron Shell said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "The dead do not hunger. They are full of the stars. As long as you feel that bite in your stomach, you are still a warrior of the Lakota." That hunger is your life telling you it wants to stay. It was the last of his winter store. He had been saving it for the journey to the high ridges, but there would be no ridges if they didn't survive the next 12 hours. Silas sucked on the dried meat, his eyes closing as the salt and protein hit his tongue. It wasn't a meal, it was a promise. But as the boy grew stronger, Iron Shell grew weaker. The isolation began to play tricks on his mind. He started to hear voices in the wind, the voices of those who had passed before. He heard the drums of a sun dance from 40 years ago. He heard the clip-clop of horses on the summer prairie. The White Death is a master of disguise. It offers you everything you want just before it takes everything you have. It offers you warmth. It offers you family. It offers you a way out of the pain. Iron Shell felt his grip on the buffalo robe slipping. His arms felt like they belonged to someone else, someone miles away. He felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to crawl out of the cave, to stand up in the wind, and to let the snow take him. It felt like it would be so light, so easy. "Grandfather, your eyes..." Silas reached out, his small hand touching Iron Shell's cheek. "You're looking at something I can't see." That touch was an anchor. It pulled him back from the edge of the great mystery. "I was just looking at the road ahead, Silas." Iron Shell lied, his voice trembling. The pressure was mounting. The storm showed no mercy. They were trapped in a pocket of air, surrounded by a frozen ocean. The psychological weight of being the only thing standing between a child and the void was starting to crush the old man. He realized then that the secret to surviving the blizzard wasn't just the snow cave or the buffalo robe. It was the burden of love. It was the refusal to leave another soul alone in the dark. But the Wazir was not done with them yet. The air in the cave was growing colder. The wind was changing direction, beginning to howl down into the ravine with renewed fury. The true test, the moment of the final sacrifice, was coming, and Iron Shell, with his failing heart and his frozen limbs, knew that he had only one gift left to give. There comes a moment in every man's life when he stops asking, "How will I survive?" and starts asking, "How will I be remembered?" The air in the cave had turned deathly still. The weight of the fresh snow on top of their burrow was pressing the ceiling down, inch by agonizing inch. Iron Shell could feel the oxygen thinning, his lungs straining to pull life from the stagnant, freezing air. But more than the air, it was the cold, the deep, ancient cold that exists between the stars, that was finally winning. Silas was slipping away. The boy's internal fire was flickering out. Iron Shell knew that the buffalo robe and the shared heat were no longer enough. The boy needed a spark. He needed the raw, vital force of life to jumpstart his slowing heart. Iron Shell looked at his own chest. His heart was a tired old drum, but it was still beating. It was a repository of 70 years of stories, of loves, of battles, and of losses. He realized that for Silas to see the morning sun, Iron Shell would have to give up his own. This was the climax of a life lived in balance with the wild. To the Lakota, sacrifice is not a tragedy, it is a bridge. Iron Shell pulled Silas closer, pressing the boy's entire body against his bare torso. He wrapped the buffalo robe entirely around the boy, tucking the edges underneath him, creating a cocoon of fur and human warmth. Iron Shell himself sat outside the robe, his back against the frozen limestone wall, his body acting as a shield against the drafts that whistled through the snow. He felt the heat leaving him. It poured out of his skin and into the boy. He felt his blood slowing, thickening like winter honey. His fingers, already numb, began to turn black at the tips. The pain was immense, a searing, white-hot agony that eventually faded into a dull, heavy thrum. "Grandfather," Silas stirred, feeling the sudden surge of warmth. "You're cold. You're shaking." "I am just dancing, Silas," Iron Shell rasped, each word a monumental effort. "The ancestors, they have started the drum. I am just practicing the steps." He gave away his memories. One by one, he channeled the warmth of those moments into the boy. He gave him the heat of the summer sun on the Missouri River. He gave him the warmth of the lodge fires during the moon of popping trees. He gave him the fire of his first love. He was emptying himself, a vessel being poured out so that another could be filled. The wind above reached a crescendo, a final, desperate howl of the wazir as it tried to break the old man's spirit. But Iron Shell did not move. He was a mountain. He was a shield. He was the history of his people, standing defiant against the end of the world. As the first hint of a grey dawn began to bleed through the snow above, Iron Shell's heart gave one final, heavy thud. He didn't feel the cold anymore. He felt the grass between his toes. He felt Ilara's hand in his. He felt the sun. When the sun finally broke over the horizon, it did not bring warmth, only light. It was a cold, golden light that glittered off the drifts like a billion scattered diamonds. In the ravine, the snow-covered mound that housed the survivors remained motionless, a silent white tomb under the shadow of the limestone cliffs. Silas crawled out into the morning, his lungs burning as they tasted the dry, thin air. He looked around at a world he didn't recognize, a world wiped clean of tracks, of paths, and of certainty. But as he turned back to the hole from which he had emerged, the realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. There is a grief that has no voice. Silas didn't scream. He didn't cry. The cold had reached too deep for tears to form. He simply sat in the snow beside his grandfather and placed his small, thawing hand over the old man's frozen heart. He felt the silence. The weight of the sacrifice was a physical thing. He understood now that he wasn't just holding a body. He was holding the last page of a book that had been written in blood and resilience. Iron Shell had not just saved his life, he had handed him a torch. The warmth Silas felt in his own limbs was the stolen heat of a man who had loved him more than he loved the breath in his own lungs. This is the peace that comes after the war, the acceptance that for one life to begin anew, another must return to the earth. Silas looked at the horizon. He was alone, miles from the winter camp, with nothing but the wisdom his grandfather had whispered in the dark. But he wasn't afraid. He could hear the wind, but it no longer sounded like a monster. It sounded like a song. He looked at the buffalo in the distance, still standing, their breath rising in plumes of steam. They had survived. He had survived. The Lakota way, the deep, rhythmic pulse of the land, had endured another winter. We often look back at the history of the Great Plains and see only the hardship. We see the blizzards, the hunger, and the relentless struggle against a landscape that offered no mercy. But if we look closer, through the eyes of men like Iron Shell, we see something else. We see the heights of human capacity. The story of the Lakota in the frost is not a story of defeat. It is a testament to the fact that the human spirit is not a candle to be blown out by the wind, but a fire that can be passed from hand to hand, generation to generation. It is a reminder that our ancestors did not just endure, they belonged. They knew the secrets of the snow, the language of the animals, and the profound power of a quiet sacrifice. Today, the winds still howl across the plains. The winters still come, and the world still grows dark. But as long as we remember the names of those who stood as shields in the night, the fire will never truly go out. Honor, resilience, and the love that defies the cold, these are the things the frost could never freeze. They are the things that make us human. They are the things that make us wild. Thank you for exploring the untamed past with us here at Wildbound History. If you believe the spirit of the frontier still lives, hit the like button and subscribe for our next survival story. Until next time, stay wild.